Okay, so good morning. So, firstly, today we'll start with the parsha for this week. This week's parsha is called Ki Tetzei. Ki Tetzei actually goes through a number of different laws. It has many laws, depending on how you count them. There's some 80 laws or so in this week's parsha, mostly very short. It goes through, it begins with the law of finding captives on the battlefield. It then goes on to speak about inheritance, and the firstborn gets double inheritance. If you recall it, a year ago, we did a class on inheritance in Judaism, explained how nowadays we don't anymore follow the Torah's laws as written, and we explained the entire evolution of how that happened and why. I refer you back to that class if anyone doesn't remember and is curious. And then continues to tell us the story of the law of a rebellious son. That it tells the prohibition of not of burying immediately when someone dies, not even allowing their body to remain overnight if possible. If someone is if you see an animal that is lost, you must return it. Same so to any other lost object, you must return it. If you see an animal that is fallen on the road, you must stop to try to help it up with its load. We have a prohibition against cross-dressing. We have a mitzvah of if you see a bird's nest of wild birds, you must shoo away the mother and take the eggs or the chicks. You cannot take the eggs or chicks without shooing away the mother. Very unique mitzvah. We a couple years ago did a class where we spoke about that mitzvah in great detail. When you have a home, a flat roof on your home, there must be a fence around the roof so that nobody falls down. For that matter, you must make sure there are no other hazards in your home. We're told the prohibition against planting different species together. And the prohibition against plowing with an ox and donkey together, not wearing garments that have a mix of wool and linen together. We went to a class on that as well. The mitzvah of tzitzit, wearing that Jewish men wear on tzitzit fringes on their four-cornered garments. We once had a class on that subject as well. The Torah then continues with, I'm not covering everything. There's a lot of different commandments here. Torah gives us certain laws of who we're allowed to marry, who we're not allowed to marry, and then tells us that when we go to battle, we must always have a pickaxe with us to always cover ourselves after we relieve ourselves, and that is really the basis of Jewish sanitary laws, which itself is a part of Jewish law. We once did a class on the Jewish obsession with cleanliness, where we spoke about Jewish sanitary laws in much greater detail. The Torah then repeats the prohibition against interest, charging a fellow Jew interest, or borrowing from a fellow Jew on interest. We've done a class on that as well, where we spoke about workarounds, how Jews do borrow from each other without charging interest. There's other ways to do it. The Torah then tells us that when you have a worker who is working in a vineyard, they're allowed to eat grapes as they work, or if they're working with grain, they're allowed to chew on the grain as they work. In other words, if someone's working with food, you cannot stop them from eating the food that they're working with. And the Torah then goes through the laws of marriage, divorce. We've done a class on marriage. I don't think we've yet done a class on divorce. Maybe we should. I don't know how popular it would be. On Jewish marriage, that is. Then we're told that for the first year after someone gets married, they should not go to the army, nor should they travel at all, but they should remain with their spouse for that first year. We're told to remember what happened to Miriam when she spoke evil about Moshe, and she got punished with tzaras, and this is a prohibition against not speaking bad about somebody else. Another subject we've done a class on before. The Torah then warns us against withholding wages from somebody who works for us. We must pay them on the day that you owe them. Cannot wait till the next morning. We're we're told that when we harvest our fields and we forget some grain behind, you must leave it for the poor. Same thing when you're harvesting your olive orchards or your vineyards, you must leave any undeveloped clusters for the poor. We're then told that if someone does commit a crime for which they deserve lashes, they get 39 lashes. The Torah then gives us a very interesting mitzvah. If a man dies and does not leave any children, their wife, and they are married, their wife must marry the brother in what we call yibum, or a levirate marriage. If they choose not to marry each other, they have the choice, then they can instead perform a ceremony called chalitza. And we once did a class on yibum and chalitza in detail, where we spoke about this in much more detail. We're warned against having incorrect measures and weights in our homes and our businesses. And then we're told to remember how Amalek attacked us on the way out of Egypt and never forget what they did to us. So these are some of the many, many, many mitzvahs that are in this week's Parsha, just to give you a very, very brief overview. We're 7 days into the month of Elul. If you recall, last week was Rosh Chodesh. We are 3 weeks from Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah starts 3 weeks from tomorrow. You've probably already received in the mail mailings about Rosh Hashanah. You've probably received free tickets. As I mentioned last week, and I've mentioned previous years, that as many people come to our shul on Rosh Hashanah, there are many, 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 many more people that do not go to shul. In fact, there aren't anywhere near as many seats in all the shuls combined as there are Jews in town, meaning the vast majority of Jews do not go to shul on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And so it's our job to bring them. We have to reach out to them, bring them, invite them. I found that the number one reason why people don't go to shul on Rosh Hashanah is discomfort, because they're uncomfortable. They're unsure where to go, what to do. They don't like going to a new place. And that is the number one reason. I've been told by multiple people that the first time they came here, they pulled up, drove here, and they were too afraid to get out of the car, and they drove back home. So the best way to counter that, the other reason is people don't want to pay for it. So the best way to counter those two things, the paying problem, just give them free tickets. That's very easy. The way to counter people's fear of something new is if you know them, invite them that you'll meet them here. If you'll meet them here, then they'll be comfortable, right? Because they'll be with someone they know. So that's always the best solution. That's something that you can do. I cannot do because I don't know your friends. So all your Jewish friends, acquaintances, neighbors, invite them to come with you to shul. I brought tickets here, so you all have tickets. And if you want extras, give out as many as you can, please. Free tickets. Tell people they have a free ticket to High Holiday Services. With our New York City Choir that is coming back for the 10th year, I believe. And they've been so good. Everyone keeps wanting them back. And we also have 2 former hostages that are going to be joining us on Rosh Hashanah. Yes, Barry?
It's going to be outside.
We're going to do, hopefully for the final time, we will do our services outside in a big tent. Our hope is that, and I'm sure Rabbi Yosef is going to talk all about it at the services, our hope is that by the end of this year, in December, we finish building our new building down the street, and then once that is built, we will have a very, very large hall that we will be able to use for high holiday services. We won't need to be in a tent anymore. In a friendship center, yeah. Yes?
The hostages, they're going to be able to go to the services?
They're going to be by all the services on Rosh Hashanah. Yes. They were unable to stay for Yom Kippur, but they will speak at the services on Rosh Hashanah. Yes. Yes. They are also, I should mention, they are doing a speech on the 14th. Probably saw this in an email. They are going to be speaking on September 14th in the Sonesta Hotel in South Redondo. So in Redondo Beach. So if you would like to hear them speak separately from services, that's on September 14th. So because we are in the month of El and getting close to Rosh Hashanah, before we get to our topic for today, I will, as I mentioned last week, we blow the shofar every day of Elul except for Shabbat. So I will blow the shofar. Please rise. Okay, before we get to our topic for today, let me open it to any questions. Does anyone have any questions on the Parsha or about Rosh Hashanah? Yes, Helene.
You said something about planting species next to each other.
Yes, we cannot plant edible species too close to each other.
I'm not too sure I understand.
Because those species are not supposed to mix with each other. We're not supposed to have different fruit trees, for example, mixing with each other. So we're not allowed to graft fruit trees into each other.
They do that all the time now.
They do that all the time now. Jewish law forbids it.
If you mix them, not kosher or something?
No, you are allowed to eat them,
Yeah.
but it forbids us from doing it.
What if they're already there?
You're allowed to. If someone else did it, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. But Jewish law forbids us from doing it. It only becomes not kosher if it's in a vineyard with grapes, which is rarely done today, as far as I know. Any other questions? So let's get straight to our topic for today, which today I wanted to talk about the Ben Ish Chai. So Rav Yosef Chayim of Baghdad, like many Jewish leaders, is best known by his book. Many Jewish leaders, we refer to them by their famous books. And so he is known by one of his many books, Ben Ish Chai. We're talking about him today because he passed in 1909 on the 13th of Elul, which will be this coming Saturday. So his yard site will be this week, and so therefore it's only appropriate to speak about him today. Now, Rav Yosef Chayim was the spiritual leader of the Baghdadi and Iraqi Jewish communities for 50 years, for the second half of the 19th century. He was probably the most renowned and most influential Sephardic scholar and leader of the 19th century. And he was one of the greatest Jewish leaders of his time of anywhere in the world. And thanks to modernization, communication in the 19th century, and thanks also to colonialism, which brought Europeans to the Middle East, he was, as a result, in direct contact with Jewish leaders of his day across the world. It was very easy in those days. Telegrams came probably later in his life, but telephones too. But even before that, letter writing was pretty easy and efficient. Mail became very efficient in the 19th century, and it was pretty easy to communicate with Jews in Eastern Europe. And so there was a lot of communication back and forth between the rabbi in Iraq and rabbis in Eastern Europe and other places. And so his influence as a result spread well beyond Iraq and well beyond the Middle East. So Rav Yosef Chayim is born in 1835 to a very wealthy, leading rabbinic family in Baghdad. In fact, his father, Chacham Eliyahu Chayim, Chayim was their family name, was the chief rabbi of Baghdad. So his father's chief rabbi. Now, the story is told that when he was 7 years old, he was playing near a well. This is before anyone had running water. Right, this is talking about the 1830s, 1840s. He was 7 years old, and there was a well in the courtyard where he was playing, and he fell into the well. And falling into a well, you can easily drown. Not always is the water that deep, but it's very hard to get out of there. So his uncle lowered himself into the well and managed to pull him out and save him. But during his time in the well, as a 7-year-old boy, he thought he would die, and he pledged that if Hashem saved him and he made it out alive, he would dedicate his life to studying and teaching Torah. And that's what he did. While all of his siblings all became businessmen, he remained, as his father had been, a Torah scholar and spent his life studying and teaching Torah. Initially, he studied under the tutelage of his mother's brother, also a great rabbi, Chacham David Chai Solomon. And he was quickly recognized as a child prodigy who was not just very, very smart, but also extremely diligent and studious, right? In order to become very knowledgeable. It's not enough to be smart. You need to be also very diligent and very studious, which he was. By the age of 14, in the early teens, he was accepted into the advanced yeshiva of mostly advanced adult students, known as Bet Zilka, which was the kind of leading yeshiva and rabbinic seminary in Baghdad at the time, led by Rav Abdullah Samech. And he was already by then known as a real child prodigy. So much so that when his father, who was the chief rabbi of Baghdad, Chacham Eliyahu Chayim, once received a letter from Rav Chaim Palaji. Rav Chaim Palaji was the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. Right, Iraq was within the Ottoman Empire at the time. He was based in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. He was the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. He wrote a letter to Rav Eliyahu Chayim asking for his opinion on a certain halachic question, and Rav Chayim showed it to his son, to his young son, Yosef Chayim, and then a couple days later he wrote his response to Rabbi Palaji. But when Rabbi Palaji then responded back to him, before I received your letter, I already received a detailed, brilliant response from your son. And so apparently he wrote his own response, although he was all of 14 years old, responding to a complex halachic question. He got married very young, as was very common in the 19th century, really wherever you lived. So when he's 17 years old in 1852, he married Rachel, who was the daughter of another great famous rabbi, Rav Yehuda Samech, one of the prominent rabbis of Baghdad. So he continued his studies, even as his family begins to grow. He has 2 children with his wife. And he is supported, however, his family is wealthy. His older brothers all go into the family business. And they were tradesmen. And as many Baghdadi Jews were, this was a time of colonialism. There was a need for trade people to really spread from Iraq all the way across India, which was under British rule, Iran, India, which is under British rule, and going all the way to China, which Britain was slowly, in the Opium Wars, getting access to. And many Baghdadi Jews, there was a very large Baghdadi community in India, later in China, many Baghdadi Jews were directly connected, and so they had their own family business. And so his family supports him, so he's able to full-time continue study. In 1859, Rav Yosef Chayim is only 24 years old. His father dies. Now, his father had been the chief rabbi of Baghdad. So at the end of the funeral, the 7 days of mourning, at the end of the 7 days of mourning, as is custom in many communities, the entire community gathered in the large synagogue of Baghdad. The large synagogue of Baghdad held 10,000 seats. So it was huge, and it was a huge synagogue. There are bigger synagogues today, believe it or not. But it was a massive synagogue. They all gathered in a large synagogue in order to memorialize their chief rabbi who had died. And among the people who get to memorialize him, who get to speak, is the rabbi's young 24-year-old son, Rav Yosef Chayim. When Rav Yosef Chayim spoke, he amazed the community with his knowledge, his Torah knowledge, weaving through the Talmud, books of scripture, and countless other books, his brilliant arguments, his charisma, his wit, his oratory skills. He was apparently had very good jokes in his speeches, and people were just amazed by his speech, so amazed by his speech that immediately afterwards the community leaders got together and said, although he's only 24 years old, we need to appoint him as the chief rabbi, and he is appointed as the chief rabbi of Baghdad, a position that he held for the next 50 years until his death at the age of 74. Any questions? So Rav Yosef Chayim was a great leader in many ways, but he's probably most famous for being one of the greatest Jewish orators, speakers of all time. He would give countless speeches. His speeches would weave Jewish law, inspirational teachings, parables, stories, jokes, all into these very, very well-attended and very, very popular lectures. In fact, he would give a daily lecture to members of the community in the smaller main synagogue, in Baghdad called Salat al-Zairi, which that synagogue, he would give every day. He would give a lecture on Shabbat afternoon, just afternoon. He would give a lecture. The synagogue would fill up. The smaller synagogue had about 1,000 seats, and it would fill up. And he would give a lecture that would usually last about 3 hours. Then 4 times a year, on special Shabbats of the year, the Shabbat before Purim, the Shabbat before Passover, the Shabbat before Shavuot, and the Shabbat before Yom Kippur, he would speak in the larger synagogue, which held 10,000 seats and would fill up, and the entire community would come to listen to his speech. Many of his speeches were later published in the many, many books that he authored. And contemporaries of his wrote about him that if Rav Yosef Chayim would have lived in temple times, the times of the temple, then the temple would have never been destroyed. Because unlike the prophets during the period of the temple, who preached that the people need to mend their ways and change their ways, and the people never listened, and as a result the temple was destroyed, Rav Yosef Chaim's speeches were deeply impactful on the entire Baghdadi community. People listened to his speeches and took them very, very seriously. So if he would have been around in temple times, people would have listened and they would have changed their ways. And indeed, during his 50-year leadership of Baghdad, the Jewish community in Baghdad, which was a very large community, it grew over that time, but it numbered tens of thousands of members, when the Jewish community in Baghdad remained deeply, deeply religious, thanks to his immense influence and his immense power of persuasion. And remember, this is during the second half of the 19th century, which was a period of general secularization throughout the world, both among Jews and non-Jews. Were moving away from religious practice everywhere. In Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East. It was true everywhere. It was not true in Baghdad, where Rav Yosef Chayim was the rabbi and preaching daily every Shabbat, and people taking his words very, very seriously. Rav Yosef Chayim was not just the chief rabbi of Baghdad, and Iraqi Jews. We did a class some time ago about Iraqi Jews. Some of you may remember. If you do not, I encourage you to listen to the recording. Iraqi Jews were mostly living in Baghdad, unlike other Jewish communities where Jews tended to live throughout the countryside, in towns and villages, and that was true in many, many places. In Iraq, Jews mostly lived in the big cities, majority of which in Baghdad, with a handful of others in other large cities, Mosul and Basra and other large cities across Iraq. So it was so the Baghdadi Jewish community was essentially the dominant community of Iraqi Jews. In fact, Iraqi Jews were not called Iraqi. Iraq didn't exist as a political entity until much, much later, until after World War I. There's no such thing as Iraq. It was known in English as Mesopotamia, but the Jews of that area were all called Baghdadi Jews, whether they're from Baghdad or another town, because Baghdad was the center. So Rav Yosef Chayim was not just the chief rabbi of Baghdad, but the chief rabbi of all of Iraq, what today we'd call Iraq. But his influence spread well beyond that, because scholars across the Jewish world sought after his views and his responses, and people would write letters to him, which he would respond to. They would seek his rulings on different questions, and he would respond. And we have countless what we call tshuvot, responses, where he responded to Jews both in the Middle East and Jewish scholars both in the Middle East and beyond who asked for his opinion on various things. Now, his halachic viewpoint was revolutionary in a number of different ways. So firstly, for hundreds of years, when there had been halachic disputes in what the law is, what tended to happen is Ashkenazi Jews tended to follow Ashkenazi scholars. And Sephardic Jews tended to follow Sephardic scholars. And this really became solidified when the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rav Yosef Karo. We did a class on the Shulchan Aruch where we explained this more in detail in the mid-16th century. Rav Yosef Karo, who was a Sephardic rabbi living in Israel, published his Shulchan Aruch, which was essentially a code of Jewish law called Set Table, which became the standard code for Sephardic Jews. All Sephardic Jews accepted it, but he had a tendency to rule when there was a debate in halacha to rule following the view of Sephardic rabbis. His contemporary, the leader of Polish Jewry at the time. Poland covered much of, was a very large country at the time that covered much of Eastern Europe, and the leader of Polish Jewry at the time was Rav Moshe Israelis, known by the acronym Rama. And Rav Moshe Israelis, when he saw the Shulchan Aruch and its popularity, he was concerned because it followed Sephardic viewpoints, not the Ashkenazi viewpoints, and so he wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch and had it printed together that he called the Mappa, the tablecloth on the set table, where he wrote the Ashkenazic perspective based on Ashkenazic scholars. And as a result, we have now this single book called Shulchan Aruch, which has both the Sephardic viewpoint and the Ashkenazic viewpoint. As a rule, Sephardim would follow Rav Yosef Karo, and Ashkenazim would follow Rav Moshe Israelis. And this really solidified and continued for a very long time, where Ashkenazim mostly followed Ashkenazic scholars and Sephardim mostly followed Sephardic scholars. Chacham Yosef Chayim really merged the two. He felt that that views of scholars of both communities should be considered. He felt that you should follow the view that you think perhaps is most correct, rather than just where they came from. They came from your community or from a different community. And so in many, many things, although he himself would have been Sephardic, living in Iraq, in many ways he followed the rulings of Ashkenazi scholars over Sephardic ones, extensively quoting Ashkenazi scholars, which was not common among Sephardic Jews, and by extension, his writings were extensively quoted by Ashkenazi contemporaries and definitely later Ashkenazi scholars. Now, I should mention that most of his halachic perspective of merging Sephardic and Ashkenazic halacha became very, very popular because became the standard for Iraqi Jews and really for most Sephardic Jews as a result of Rav Yosef Chayim's influence. That perspective was later reversed in the 20th century by Rav Yosef, who was the former chief rabbi of Israel. He passed away just a little over a decade ago, and perhaps we could do a class on Rav Yosef, very important 20th century Jewish figure who had an enormous amount of influence on Jewish life, but so he reversed a lot of that, returning to more pure, what we'd call Sephardic halacha. Rav Yosef Chayim, in addition to being a great halachic expert, was also a great Kabbalist, great expert in Kabbalah. And while in Ashkenazi communities, particularly in Hasidic communities, there had been a very strong influence of Kabbalah on Jewish law. In other words, in places where Jewish law, where the Kabbalists sided with a particular perspective in Jewish law, Hasidic communities tended to follow the Kabbalistic perspective. We spoke about that more in detail a couple of weeks ago when we spoke about the different versions of prayer, and we spoke about how the Hasidic communities adopted the Kabbalistic versions of prayer based on the Arizal. So Chacham Yosef Chayim, the Ben Ish Chai, also invoked or brought in a lot of Kabbalistic perspectives on halacha, and therefore brought Kabbalah or Kabbalistic teachings into Jewish law. And his halachic works became very, very popular, particularly his work called Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai is a book of halacha, of Jewish law, that follows the weekly Torah portion, and it was printed during his lifetime, became extremely, extremely popular, and it really became the standard book of Jewish law that Sephardic Jews would turn to when they wanted to know the law. And his rulings overall were greatly valued by both Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazic Jews. Chacham Yosef Chayim, the Ben Ish Chai, also wrote an enormous amount on every conceivable Jewish topic. He wrote on halacha and Jewish law, on Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. He wrote inspirational lessons. He explained many of the stories of the Talmud. A lot of commentaries have been written on the Talmud over the years, but most of them gloss over the stories and explain the legal debates of the Talmud. He spends a lot of time explaining the stories of the Talmud and the stories of different midrashim. He wrote books on Jewish on on explaining the debates of the Talmud as well. He wrote books explaining the Torah and the other works of Scripture. He wrote books on prayers, books of prayers. He also was a great poet and wrote many, many poems as well. During his own lifetime, he printed dozens of books. Today we have over 60 of his books that have been published. We believe there was a lot more that was lost that we don't have, and there are still a number of books that exist only in manuscript. So we have manuscripts, but we have never, for whatever reason, never been published. There is an organization in Israel, that Avat Shalom, that is dedicated to publishing all of his works, redoing his works that have been published and publishing all his works that have not yet been published. As I mentioned, the Ben Ish Chai is a book of halacha, of Jewish law, based on his lectures, his weekly Shabbat lectures, where he would speak on Jewish law, and that became by far his most popular books. After his death, an enormous number of books remained in manuscript, many of which, I should mention that when he printed his books in his lifetime, I forgot to mention, he printed all of his books in Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at the time had a printing press, but it was a small printing press, and there were better presses. In fact, there were printing presses in Baghdad, Jewish Hebrew printing presses, and certainly lots of great Hebrew printing presses elsewhere in Eastern Europe and in Europe and across the Mediterranean. There were many places he could have gone to print his books, but he insisted on printing them only in Jerusalem. After his death, he left an enormous number of books in manuscript. Many of those books were printed by his son and successor, Rabbi Yaakov Chayim, and some by his grandson, Rabbi David Chayim, who later came to the land of Israel. Now, in 2003, after the United States defeated Iraq in the Iraq War, and the U.S. Army discovered a collection of Jewish books and manuscripts in the basement of a Iraqi intelligence building. It had been flooded, but it was found in the basement of this building. It appears that Jews in 1948 and 49 were expelled from Iraq, and Israel then arranged for them to be flown from Iraq to the land of Israel, and essentially almost all the Jews of Iraq were forced to leave, and they left everything behind. They were not allowed to take anything with them, unless they left all their books, manuscripts, and everything. And it seems that the Iraqi government at the time collected it and was just storing it for decades, for more than 50 years. And so it was found in 2003. These documents were restored because there was a lot of water damage to them. They were restored at the expense of Iraqi Jews in the United States who funded it. They were also then digitalized, and they're all available now online. These documents are now temporarily found in the United States National Archives. The United States did make a commitment when they took those documents out of Iraq. They made a commitment to the Iraqi government that they will return them. So we are under agreement to return those documents to Iraq. The Jewish community has strongly opposed that, returning the documents to Iraq, because these are not Iraqi treasures, but Jewish treasures, and there are no Jews left in Iraq. They've all been kicked out, right? So they rather should go to the Jewish community, either in the United States or in the Iraqi Jewish community, either in the United States or in Israel. But anyway, that's an issue that's still being debated. Congress passed a law, a resolution calling for the documents to remain in the United States. I'm not sure it helped much, but it's still here for now. Anyway, this is all relevant because when we discovered in these documents, we discovered a number of manuscripts of the Ben Ish Chai that were unknown, were not printed, are now available since the entire collection has been digitalized, and a number of them have since been even printed as books. Yes?
Is it written in Hebrew or in Arabic?
He wrote in every language. He wrote in Hebrew and he wrote in Arabic. He wrote in both. The Arabic he wrote would be Jewish Arabic, which is with Hebrew letters. So he wrote in both. In fact, he wrote a book on the Torah for Jewish women, explaining the Torah in kind of with stories, and the Jewish women at the time were not very well educated because women didn't go to school. This is the mid-19th century. At least in Iraq, they weren't going to school then. And he wrote a book dedicated for Jewish women to read. in Arabic, right? Because they wouldn't have understood Hebrew.
Like over here, just said-
Yes, he wrote a number of books in Arabic, yes. He also wrote many, many poems. We have a number of poems, some of which were printed in his books, some of which were kind of just survived in manuscript. A book of 30 of his poems was published recently. His most famous poem that he wrote is Va'amartem Ko Lachai, which is a poem about the great sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose anniversary of his passing we mark on Lag BaOmer. And many people go to the pilgrimage in Meron, and that poem, many songs have been made with the words of that poem, and it's become probably the most popular poem for Lag BaOmer, and it's widely known widely known and recited. So that's probably his most famous poem, but he wrote many, many poems.
You don't have
Yes.
that poem with you, do you?
Not right now, no. The Ben Ish Chai had a very, very deep love for the land of Israel. He spoke about the land of Israel constantly. He encouraged members of his community to go to the land of Israel, to support the land of Israel. He himself, as we mentioned, published all his books in Jerusalem only. When a wealthy Baghdadi Jew called Yosef Avraham Shalom from Calcutta, India, and remember I mentioned earlier that during the 19th century, large numbers of Baghdadi Jews moved to India and China, where they served as traders, helping the British, who were colonizing the Far East, India, and the Far East at the time. And many Jews became enormously wealthy at that time in this trade. So Yosef Avram Shalom wanted to use his wealth, give charity, and he wanted to build a Jewish hospital in Baghdad. Rav Yosef Chayim suggested that rather than building a Jewish hospital in Baghdad, which would be a very noble thing to do, he should instead use the money to build a yeshiva in Jerusalem. And so he did that. He bought land near the western wall, right across from the Kotel, and he built a yeshiva that was called Porat Yosef, after him. His name was Yosef, right? It was called Porat Yosef. And it became the most prominent, most prestigious Sephardic yeshiva in the world. It remains so today, well over a century later. It remains the most important, prestigious Sephardic yeshiva in the world. It stands still. If you go to the Kotel, it towers over the Kotel. There's a big, big building right behind the Kotel, Porat Yosef. And it remains the most important Sephardic yeshiva, and virtually every major Sephardic rabbi and scholar of the last 100 plus years has studied in Porat Yosef and are graduates of that yeshiva. Pretty much every Sephardic chief rabbi of the land of Israel, Sephardic chief rabbis from all over have studied in Porat Yosef, established by the Ben Ish Chai. Although he's living in Baghdad, he established this yeshiva. Yes, Mayor.
Is that where Asia Torah is?
It's near Asia Torah. Yes, it is further south of Asia Torah. If you turn your back to the Kotel, it would be straight to your left. In 1869, he went himself to visit the land of Israel. He first stopped in Damascus, where he was very warmly welcomed by the whole Jewish community there. Damascus itself at the time had a very large Jewish community. Damascus is extremely close to the land of Israel, and Jews in Damascus essentially could go on a day trip to the land of Israel. Right? It's hard for us to imagine today because they're different countries and there's no Jews left in Damascus. But Damascus is a couple miles, right, from the land of Israel. It's very, very close. And so from Damascus, he traveled to the Galilee, and he went around to many, many graves of biblical and Mishnah era scholars. It was there at the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that he composed his famous song, Va'amartem Ko Lachai, the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Meron. When he arrived at the grave of Benoyahu ben Yehoyada, which is just north of the town of Tzfat in the Galilee. Benoyahu ben Yehoyada was a general of King Solomon. He lived in the days of King Solomon, mentioned in the book of Kings and in the book of Chronicles, and he was Solomon's essentially general, his head of his army. According to the Talmud, he was also the leader of the Sanhedrin, of the Supreme Council of the Supreme Council of Judaism at the time. So when he arrived but this is going back to the days of King Solomon, when he arrived at Benayahu ben Yehoyada's grave, he spent some time there. And he later said that while he was there, he got this revelation that his soul is connected to the soul of Benayahu ben Yehoyada. And so therefore, many of the books that he wrote, some of them he called Benayahu or Ben Yehoyada. He wrote a book called Benayahu, and he wrote another book called Ben Yehoyada. But also the Book of Kings and Chronicles have a number of descriptions about Benayahu Ben Yehoyada, and he called many of his books using words or descriptions related to Benayahu Ben Yehoyada, including the term Ben Ish Chai, the son of a living man, which the Book of Kings uses in reference to Benayahu Ben Yehoyada. From the Galilee, he then traveled to Jerusalem, where he spent some time in Jerusalem already since the mid-19th century. There was a yeshiva called Yeshivat Bet El, which is a school dedicated to the study of Kabbalah. It was one of the few, it still remains today, one of the few schools dedicated to the study of Kabbalah. Most other schools study the Talmud, Halacha, Jewish law, and maybe they'll study Kabbalah on the side, but this is a school dedicated just to the study of Kabbalah. Its scholars spent all day studying Kabbalah. It's been around for now close to 200 years. So he stops in Bet El. He was a great Kabbalist, and he spends time studying there in Bet El, in the yeshiva with the scholars there. He then travels to Hebron, where he goes to the caves of the patriarchs, and he meets with scholars and Kabbalists in Hebron as well. Then he went back to Baghdad. When he came back to Baghdad, on his way, he brought dirt from the land of Israel, which he scattered all across the floor of the synagogue that he prayed in Baghdad. In those days, the synagogues in Baghdad had dirt floors. And he also brought with him a large stone from the land of Israel, which he put near the entrance to the synagogue, along with a sign that this is a stone from the land of Israel. So he lived today would have been considered a very long life, but then it would have been. He dies at the age of 74 on the 13th of Elul in 1909. So a little over 100 years ago, in Baghdad. His funeral is attended by all the Jews of Baghdad, numbering probably, we don't have exact numbers, but probably 70, 80,000 people at the time. It was a very large Jewish community. And all the Jews, many non-Jews, attend his funeral, and his son, Yaakov Chayim, is appointed as successor to Rav Yosef Chayim. He was really the leading Sephardic Halachic scholar of his day. He had countless students. Most Iraqi Jewish scholars for 50 years were his students. And many of them ended up, he dies in 1909, the Iraqi Jewish community. After that, the entire community is expelled. Many of the senior leaders of the Iraqi Jewish community were students of the Ben Ish Chai when they came to the land of Israel. They dominated Sephardic scholarship in the land of Israel. And today, most Sephardic rabbis are students of the Ben Ish Chai's students. So they're second, third generation from the Ben Ish Chai, but their teachers, their teachers' teachers, or their teachers' teachers' teachers studied under the Ben Ish Chai, which gives him a lot of influence today over Sephardic halacha. He also raised the level of Sephardic scholarship in his day. Until the 19th century, while Sephardic scholars were once the leading scholars among the Jewish people, there were many Sephardic, to be clear, there were many Sephardic scholars over the years, throughout the years in between, from the 16th to the 19th century. But the Sephardic scholars in many ways had not been on par, there were very few Sephardic scholars on par with Ashkenazi scholars during this period. And he really changed that. Almost single-handedly, raising, at least within the Iraqi Jewish community, raising the level of Jewish scholarship. very, very significantly, which led then the Iraqi Jewish scholars to dominate the Sephardic scholarship in the land of Israel. And really, in the long run, it was his students that really raised Sephardic scholarship to today, where more than 50% of rabbis in Israel today are Sephardic rabbis. And there are countless Sephardic scholars, and a lot of this is due to his influence till today. He also was successful in merging Sephardic and Ashkenazic halacha in ways that people before him had not done. And notably, he also brought, as a great Kabbalist, in addition to a great Halachic expert, he brought Kabbalah deep into the consciousness of Sephardic Jewry. So he was very, very influential, great 19th century rabbi, scholar, one of the greatest, perhaps, of all Jewish scholars of that period, and extremely influential. His influence continues till today. Let me take some questions. Yes, Mayor.
Was the chief rabbi one of his rabbis?
The chief rabbi today,
The chief rabbi that just passed away.
Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef himself was too young to be a student of the Ben Ish Chai, but his father was a student of the Ben Ish Chai, and many of his teachers were students of the Ben Ish Chai. Right, he was born after the Ben Ish Chai passed away. Yes,
I had a question about the.
Michael.
You said he had a big influence on Kabbalah being in Sephardic.
Mhm.
Which is it bigger, do you think, Sephardic Jews or Ashkenazi Jews?
Where's Kabbalah more impactful?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. I would say it's very impactful in both. In the Ashkenazi community, the Hasidic community, among Ashkenazi Jews, the Hasidic community are very into Kabbalah. Even non-Hasidic, there are some. Much of the Sephardic community is also. I don't know if I have a way to measure where it's stronger. Thankfully, over time, although there's been a lot of differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews over time, remember, we're 99% the same in all the Jewish law. The variations are small and slight, and mostly cultural, food and things that don't matter that much. But I think with time, increasingly, as the communities have kind of started to live together in the second half of the 20th century, here in the United States, Ashkenazic Jews dominate in the United States. It's about 90%. But Sephardic Jews have a sizable, population here. And in Israel, where it's probably about 50-50, there's been a lot of merging of the two communities, both through physical, through marriage, intermarriage between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, which is very, very common today, and but just in general for the perspectives to merge, which is normal. It happens over time, and we've seen this throughout history as Jewish communities. As Jewish communities kind of are forced to live together from different places, they tend to stay separate for some time, sometimes even a few hundred years, but over time they tend to merge. So we are seeing more and more Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews coming together, but at the same time, I think it's important that Ashkenazi Jews keep their heritage and keep the Ashkenazi heritage strong, and Sephardic Jews do the same. So that's also important.
Is there a third category?
So there's many. We've done a couple classes on this, and we've done some courses on this. It's a very good question. It's a little not directly related to the Ben Ish Chai, but it's an excellent question. There are many, many Jewish communities. Ashkenazic Jewry subdivide into countless communities. Sephardic Jewry also subdivides into countless different communities. And we went to a course on the evolution of, some of you may have been there, of the evolution of Judaism and the Jewish communities, where we spoke about this more in detail. There are also communities that are not technically part of any, including all the Mizrahi communities, all of the Eastern communities that lived in Iran, in Bukhara, Afghanistan, kind of east of where Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews dwelled. There's Yemeni Jews, there are Italian Jews. We touched on it also when we did the class on the different versions of prayer, right? We mentioned kind of how the versions evolved. A lot of it had to do with the different cultures. So yeah, there's a lot of, there are other smaller communities.
I once recently read it was Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Middle Eastern. Like they
Right, so Mizrahi. Mizrahi is Middle Eastern. It's a little complicated, but since we have a few minutes, I don't mind getting into it a little bit. So the Sephardic, when we did our class on Iraqi Jewry, you may remember, the Sephardic diaspora, meaning the Jews that left Spain in 1492, spread across the Ottoman Empire, which means that they came in large numbers to Iraq. At the time that they came to Iraq in the 16th century, because I believe it was 1515, if I'm not mistaken, when Iraq came under Ottoman rule, and that's when Jews started coming in large numbers. There was a tiny Jewish community, if any, in Iraq. There was no significant Jewish community. There had been a massive Jewish community back from the days of the Babylonian exile. It had been entirely decimated by the Mongols in the 13th century. So it had dwindled for a long time, but it had been decimated. So when the Sephardic Jews came, Iraq was primarily a Sephardic community. The Kurdi community was actually not Sephardic, the Jews in Kurdistan, but they were there for a long time before that. But Iranian Jews, and we did this in our class, we did a class on the Jews of Iran, Iranian Jews are not Sephardic. They are not from Spain. Very few Spanish Jews, as far as we know, made it to Iran. They are not Sephardic.
So the Iraqi Jews are Sephardic primarily because they mostly came from Spain.
They're mostly descendants of people who came from Jews who came from Spain, yes.
Is this synagogue, what's the status of this huge synagogue? Is that
I don't know where these synagogues are today. They've probably been destroyed.
in Iraq?
In Iraq, yes. They've probably been destroyed.
Let me ask a question. We'll talk about it can be sensitive. Usually Ashkenazi don't talk much about the Sephardic figures, people, but why this guy is more important than to be taking a class on?
Usually Ashkenazi Jews don't talk much about Sephardic figures. I'm not sure why you say
don't
that.
say they don't recognize it, just it's a separation.
I'm going to take issue with that.
Huh?
I'm going to take issue with that statement. I think it's normal for people to be more familiar with their own community and culture. That's kind of because that's what you know. I think today, where we have the knowledge and resources to learn beyond our own communities, we should. I think throughout Jewish history, Jews were very familiar and in contact with each other. In other words, in any halachic book that you will open from any period, whether Ashkenazi, Sephardi, or from anywhere it will be, they are quoting countless scholars from other places. And you will see that. Some scholars become more famous, some become less, some don't become as famous. Some are more influential, some are less influential. Why? Partly because of their scholarship, their personalities, partly due to luck. That isn't always explained. Rav Yosef Chayim, the Ben Ish Chai, who we dealt with today, was extremely influential. He was easily the greatest and most influential Sephardic scholar of his day. He was living in a time when communication was pretty robust in the late 19th century. And that meant that Jews in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe were very, very well aware of him and read his books, because his books could be bought in a bookstore in Vilna or in Warsaw and or in Berlin. So he was very, they knew about him. He was well known. Other Sephardic scholars did not become as famous, did not become as well known. Same is true for many Ashkenazi scholars, right? They don't become famous. So we know some people are more famous than others, depending on their influence and the impact that they made. And definitely, as communication improved, we always had communication, but as communication improved, our ability to be aware of and connect to other great Jewish scholars of the day, becomes much, much stronger. Yes.
The Italians, they had a printing press. They printed Talmud in the 1200s and all. They're considered Ashkenazis?
That's a good question. Jewish printing started in the mid-15th century. So it starts in the mid-15th century. Italy, for much of the period, at least definitely in the 16th century, was the center of printing. More accurately, Venice was the center of printing. At a certain point, Venice and Italy kind of lost its shine. Jews in Italy, where did they come from? Italian, German. We should do a class on Jews. We have to do a class on the Jews of Italy. No, the Jews of Italy, actually, there are 3 different Italian Jewish communities. There is the original Italian Jewish community that were always there. There is, and I mentioned this when we did a class on the Siddur, I think I mentioned this. There are Ashkenazi Jews that moved to